Well, let's understand when we say getting addicted to imperialism, when we're using those phrases for countries, I mean, what do you get addicted to as a country? Well, let's just
Continue straight for 20 minutes to Labas, flyover north.
go over this quickly because I think we all get it. But how about raw materials? How long have people been invading and conquering places to get somebody else's stuff? In this modern era, you also have these unequal trade agreements which can lock a colony into, turning over large chunks of their raw materials and wealth at reduced or non-existent rates of exchange. Prestige in this era is huge. You will have a bunch of countries that are latecomers to the colonial party who will take the few leftover places just so that they have another place, another notch on their belt. The reason those places weren't taken by a great power is they had nothing anybody wanted. The last thing they have is that they add to your prestige. I now have 6 colonies. The last time you saw me, Britain, I only had 5. I'm moving up in the world. Now, those are the things that attract you to these countries in the first place, right? What's the first reason you start using the steroids? Well, I was just dabbling. I wanted to get a little bigger. I was recovering from an injury. I needed the raw materials, the trade position, and a little prestige. I wanted to be big like the other guys. It's all understandable. But when you get involved in it, then you're kind of committed and you get sucked into something deeper. This is why I like this analogy. And the thing that sucks countries into the colonial lifestyle are things like the capital investments that you begin to make as a country, or your companies do, or your companies in conjunction with a country do, putting in railroads, mining, development in all these local places. You begin to have a stake that if people start saying, listen, the change in foreign affairs dictates it would be best for us to leave this area now and turn it back over to the locals, you're going to have a lot of powerful, rich people who are going to say, wait a minute, what about our investment? And that's, of course, just money. What about lives? The lives it takes to conquer these places and the lives it takes to keep them conquered. I mean, for example, the Japanese will get their hands on Taiwan at a certain point by some sort of treaty deal, but the people in Taiwan weren't asked, and the Japanese will lose quite a few people trying to pacify that area that supposedly on a piece of paper they were just handed over. I mean, this becomes not just a cost you have to pay to play this game, right? An entry fee into the colonial games. It's a cost you have to keep paying to stay in the game, and it provides another investment that keeps you from having the flexibility. If the times dictate that it'd be better to give up this policy of colonialism or steroid use, somebody's going to say, well, wait a minute, my son died conquering that territory. Are you going to make his sacrifices meaningless? Are you going to undo everything his life bought? I mean, do you see how that sucks you in as a country? I mean, remember, too, that the Japanese are seeing these European powers sort of at the height of the good times, while they're riding high in the addiction, and they're lifting weights, and they're taking steroids, and they're going to the tanning salon, and they're covering themselves with baby oil, and they're getting their hair bleached, and they look great, right? They're not seeing these countries down the road, on the downside of this addiction, when they're in the old folks home prematurely with all the health care problems, and the steroids are gone, and the muscles are shriveled, and they look and feel awful. I mean, when the Japanese look at the French in what's called Indochina, for example, modern-day Vietnam, they see the French sitting there having the Vietnamese serve them food in restaurants and a wonderful colonial existence, while of course the French pay them back by giving them French culture and everything. It's a traditional colonial trade-off. The Japanese will not see the French 90 years from this time period, when in the 1950s they're fighting a vicious insurgency by the Viet Minh trying to kick the French out of Vietnam. Go talk to them then. But of course, by that time, in the 1950s, the Japanese are in full recovery mode after a global intervention put an end to its steroid addiction, its half-century-long steroid addiction, that if it wanted to go back and trace the roots of how it began, that initial taste that seemed so consequence-free, that got you hooked and led you down that terrible path, the rise and fall of Japan's imperialism addiction. It starts with Korea, which was just sitting there, wasn't it? Like a dagger aimed at the heart of Japan, as the German advisor from Bismarck told the Japanese government. The Japanese had already treated Korea very shortly after it was opened up against its will by the Western powers to that exact same treatment, and then foisted the same sort of unequal treaties on Korea that the West had foisted on Japan. So Japan learns quickly. They were ripe for trying out what the Western powers were, building their muscles up with. And the first hit free happened in Korea. In the 1870s and 1880s, the Japanese involved themselves more and more in internal Korean politics and dynamics. Korea is generally in the sphere of influence of the great Jupiter of the region, China, but increasingly as the Russians have advanced all the way to the Pacific, they have more of an impact too in that area. But to the Japanese, this is a key. I mean, if this were
Watch out, crash reported ahead.
a game of Risk or something where there were no morals or ethics or anything involved, right? Because the Korean people will suffer terribly, into this time period we're getting into. But let's imagine people don't matter in a Risk game. If you're playing Japan, you want to take Korea. During this time period, the Chinese and the Russians are in a much better position than you are. So what do? Well, in 1894, somehow, Japan ends up in a war over the sphere of influence control of Korea with China. 1894, it's called the First Sino-Japanese War, and it is really the first time that this new army of Japan, since they opened up, leaves Japan to fight somebody else, not counting, island insurrections and whatnot off Japan's coast. I have to throw in these little disclaimers because someone will say, well, you forgot that little teeny thing here. Okay, first major one. By the way, outside observers, for the most part, believe that China will crush Japan. Both China and Japan have been undergoing military modernization for kind of the same reason, both of them finding themselves dangerously vulnerable to Western technology, so working to catch up. The stated opinion out there by most people was that China had done a better job, including having a fleet. I love the way, this is the time period where race and all that stuff is so important. They had the most powerful Asian fleet in Asia, it was thought. And in a stunning, absolutely stunning campaign, the Japanese just rolled the Chinese on land and at sea. And it's much more shocking, probably, if you read the observers at sea, where they destroy the Chinese fleet so terribly that historian Mary B. Jensen says China won't have another blue water navy for 100 years. The Chinese admiral commits suicide. On land, it's interesting. The Japanese are so dominant, they're dishing out casualties at 10-to-1 ratios, 15-to-1 ratios, and you can't label any single advantage as being dominant because, if you sort of delve into it a little bit, the Japanese seem dominant sort of across the board. Both Chinese and Japanese militaries had modernized, but the Japanese had done it in a lot better of a way. They made better choices. The Chinese had gone with the banner system. It didn't work. It's a coming out party on the world stage, and it is shocking to Westerners who don't have a lot of respect for Orientals to begin with, but if they have respect for any of them, it's China, even though they're biting off pieces of China and whatnot. To them, China still represents sort of the wisdom of the East and Confucian ideas and this great culture, theoretically. These Japanese are nothing but upstarts, and these Japanese go into this war with China and end up winning it while losing less. Usually the numbers you see are less than 1,500 men killed in combat. Less than 1,500 men killed in combat? That's astounding. Chinese numbers are, 10 times that or something. The idea that you could win a war with China and lose less than 1,500 men killed? Well, with the downside of imperialism seemingly that small, anybody could get hooked, couldn't they? The first thing that the Japanese got out of this war, which they clearly wanted, from the emperor down to the, average Japanese person on the street, was respect and prestige on the international world stage. The other great powers sat up and took notice. In 1895, the year the war ended, Lord Charles Beresford was quoted in the Times of London as saying, quote, "Japan has, within 40 years, gone through the various administrative phases that occupied England about 800 years, and Rome about 600, and I am loath to say that anything is impossible with her. end quote. There was a lot of admiration, but it was still tempered by this idea that, yes, they're pretty amazing for Oriental folk. I mean, it was an almost racialist view of things. Wow, they have moved themselves up to the top of the food chain amongst their people in that part of the world. I mean, and that was the progressive way of looking at things. There were people around the Russian Tsar, and again, pardon, this is going to sound like racism, folks, but we're talking about one of the most racist periods in world history, and it impacts decision-making. And the people around the Russian Tsar thought of the Japanese, and there was one quote of, they're just yellow monkeys. Okay, well, what happens to you if it's your job to deal with yellow monkeys, and you're trying to figure out, okay, how many troops do we need on the border with those people? I mean, when you're trying to make conscious decisions about how you should behave, but your view of reality is so tainted by your racism that you can't possibly imagine these people doing anything that would hurt you. And that's what a lot of the other people said. The Japanese were able to do this to the Chinese because obviously the Chinese are weak as heck. They'd never be able to do it to a white nation. Well, the end of Japan's war with China here opens up the door to them having a problem with their first European nation, because Japan gets a peace treaty extracted from China that is like hitting the jackpot in Las Vegas for the Japanese. First of all, the terms are that they get a ton of money. It's like the equivalent of 4 years of Japan's total budget handed over to them. They also get the island of Taiwan, which is huge, and the surrounding smaller islands. Right, so here's Japan's first colony. They also get an agreement that they will sort of have the sphere of influence control of Korea, and in order to make that work, they have to get this peninsula, which is strategically very important. So it's all part of the deal. Japan has sort of had this coming out party. They're in the great powers now, and then all of a sudden, I love the way R. Taggart Murphy describes it. He says it's the equivalent of having 3 old seasoned lions come in and steal the first kill of a young leopard who's just learning how to hunt and just, thinks he's hit the jackpot. No, we're going to alter the terms of the deal, said the 3 lions, metaphorically named France, Germany, and Russia. In a move known as the Triple Intervention, those 3 powers come in and tell Japan that they can't extract the treaty from China that they want to, for the sake of the peace of Asia, they said. But in reality, Japan figured that all 3 of those countries had their own ideas about things in China that they wanted, and so they told the Japanese in no uncertain terms, giving them no choice, by the way, we'll have China pay you more money than the original deal called for, but you don't get to have that important strategic peninsula that has that port named Port Arthur on it. Now, I should point out something about Port Arthur before we go any farther, because it's germane to the story. Port Arthur was the site of a terrible massacre in the Sino-Japanese War that just ended. In it, the Japanese army went in and killed men, women, and children. Between 1,000 is the low-end number you see, and the high-end possible number is 20,000. That's a huge gap, obviously, but there are other people that take that number much, 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 much higher than that. But there really aren't that many people in that region, so they're not really that credible. But just know that the incredible numbers go much higher than 20,000. The reason it's important, though, is because you will see on display things that both look medieval to modern people in the late 19th century, and things that are going to be reminiscent of incidents we will see over and over in the Second World War. The Japanese go into Port Arthur, and the 3 rationales, just so you know, that you'll get for this, you'll get for the other, basically, situations like in the Second World War. You got them at the time, you will get them today from ultranationalists. There's 3. One is that these incidents happened when atrocities were committed against Japanese troops, and so the soldiers kind of lose their minds for a while. The suggestion is that this is understandable for troops in combat, and that it's not something that the army itself condones, but it's understandable, right? So you have the atrocity thing. The second thing you'll often hear is that the press is reporting that these are civilians, but they're really enemy soldiers who are trying to hide from our troops and live to snipe at them and everything from behind buildings, dressed as civilians. So all these people that look like civilians are really enemy soldiers. And the last thing you will hear, reliably, is that the numbers are inflated. Now, there is some potential truth to the numbers are inflated thing, because in the same way you have ultra-nationalists all around the planet now trying to revamp the way the world views perhaps, we'll call them negative chapters in the history of their military that they're rightfully proud of, but every nation has them. I mean, the Chinese, for example, have an interest in magnifying Japanese crimes against Chinese citizens, and the
In 1.5 kilometers. Continue straight to Libus, fly over north.
if you're patriotic, have interest in seeing the numbers in the best possible light. It's all understandable, but I'm going to let historians argue that sort of stuff. I'm just going to try to stick to the facts, and I'm going to try to give multiple sides. But here's what an eyewitness, and there were several,
Police reported ahead.
Westerners in Port Arthur when the massacre happened. Here's how he described it, and just so you know, you could take this description out of this time period in this event, substitute it for any number of incidents that happened in the Second World War, and you wouldn't know that it wasn't written then because they have a tragically familiar ring to them. This author who witnessed the events at the massacre of Port Arthur in the First Sino-Japanese War described it this way, quote, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday were spent by the soldiery in murder and pillage from dawn to dark, in mutilation, in every conceivable kind of nameless atrocity, until the town became a ghastly inferno, to be remembered with a fearsome shudder until one's dying day. I saw corpses of women and children, 3 or 4 in the streets, more in the water. Bodies of men strewed the streets in hundreds, perhaps thousands, for we could not count. Some with not a limb unsevered, some with their heads hacked, cross-cut and split lengthwise, some ripped open, not by chance, but with careful precision, down and across, disemboweled and dismembered, with occasionally a dagger or bayonet thrust in the private parts. I saw groups of prisoners tied together in a bunch, with their hands behind their backs, riddled with bullets for 5 minutes and then hewn to pieces. I saw a junk stranded on the beach, filled with fugitives of either sex and of all ages, struck by volley after volley, until I can say no more. End quote. Now, it's worth going through a few thoughts for a minute here. The first one is that there's nothing unusual about an event like this, is there? Your history books are littered with this stuff, going back to the beginning of time, practically. Go read the Assyrian annals. Sometimes it seems like it's nothing but that start to finish. But things are starting to change in this period we're coming into, right? Early 20th century. And you can't necessarily get away with things that people got away with forever. Nation states, for example, armies, powers, kingdoms, warlords, whatever you want to say. I mean, if you're, what's that old philosophical experiment? If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, did it really make a sound? Well, if some terrible massacre occurs of some out-of-the-way people in a remote region and no one ever hears about it outside the little locality, does it really matter? Well, in this time period, you know, when you're coming into the 20th century here now, we have telegraphs and communication on that level, well, it's starting to really matter. First of all, good luck trying to keep it a secret. That account we just read to you slipped out, didn't it? It wasn't the only one. Would that have happened 500 years before this time? The second important point is when it slips out and people in other countries hear of it, they have the ability, if there's enough of them and they're angry enough, to make you feel their anger. And this will be a key part in the story too, when public opinion in other countries begins to try to make you conform to their standards. Standards that, by the way, are changing radically in the 20th century. Another standard that's changing is the outright idea of, you know, the right of one country to conquer another and take it over. I mean, this has been pretty well established and understood. In the 20th century, it starts becoming uncool, especially amongst the more cool powers. I mean, the old-fashioned ones like, you know, the Germans and the Russians, and of course now the Japanese may still think you can go in there and take other people over, but we more sophisticated powers understand that that's just, it's immorally wrong. Meanwhile, they'll go and establish a protectorate over someone else, you know, which is a treaty-bound agreement we have with them to safeguard their needs and help them develop, you know, you see what I'm saying. I mean, it will require many more layers of diplomatic cover to conquer or control areas in the 20th century. In the old days, you could just take them over. Well, there are still powers that live by the old rules, and there will be a public opinion prize for doing that. I should also point out that the training of the Japanese military was unlike the training of any other great power military. In fact, it's hard for me to find any organized military in the late 19th or 20th.
In 300 meters, continue straight to Libus, flyover north.
Century that trained their soldiers the way the Japanese were trained. I mean, here in the U.S., for example, for a long time, I don't know if they do this anymore, but Marines, for example, used to have combat with each other in boot camp. And basically they use weapons that are sticks with padded ends, so you're fighting, in hand-to-hand.
Continue straight to Libus, flyover north.
Like that. The Japanese, in the Second World War and before, I don't know if it comes into this period. I have to be very honest with you. I tried to find research. I don't know if it goes back into this period. But in the Second World War and in the 1930s, Japanese troops will often be trained on live people. There are photos, and they're horrible, that you can go and see online. Japanese soldiers bayoneting,
In 200 meters, stay to the left to 11, Libus Tunnel north.
Training exercises with the other recruits whose turn is not now, watching, bayoneting Chinese prisoners whose hands are tied.
Stay to the left to 11, Libus Tunnel north.
There's multiple photos of Japanese captives or whatnot tied to stakes and had bayonet practice and sword. I mean, there's an account by a Japanese officer who talks about his training involving having to slice the head off somebody. And if you look at paintings of the Sino-Japanese War made by Japanese artists, there's some that show the mass beheadings of Chinese captives with samurai swords. Now, Japan's victory over China had big ramifications because it was the equivalent of throwing blood and chum into the shark-infested colonial waters and telling the rest of the world that the recent victories by Britain in the Opium Wars and whatnot wasn't a sign of temporary Chinese inability to deal with Western military technology. It was the beginning of the end of maybe this Chinese imperial dynasty. There was obviously some sort of a rotting house apparent after the Japanese kicked the door down. That led to something called the Boxer Rebellion, where Western territories ended up
In 1.1 kilometers, continue straight on Aurora, flyover north.
8 powers, only one of them Asian. Want to guess who it was? Yes, the Japanese. And they sent as many troops as everyone else put together. Basically, throwing their lot in with the club. We belong in the club. We're here. Looking at a map, they probably had more of a right to be there than anyone else. Now, the next big foreign policy milestone on the way to our story here involves a war that the Japanese get involved with in 1904 against the Russians. The Russians, who were one of the 3 lions that said, for the peace of Asia, you can't have this Port Arthur area, just not right, and forced the Japanese to give in. The Japanese always thought that Russia really wanted it for themselves. Within 3 years, the Russians had taken it, confirming the Japanese suspicions, and then started fortifying Port Arthur. The whole thing. So in 1904, when the Japanese had decided, for all sorts of reasons,
In 300 meters, continue straight.
that they still needed to control this area, they launched, let's just call it a pre-aircraft version of a Pearl Harbor on the
Continue straight on Aurora, flyover north.
Russian Far Eastern Fleet, having torpedo boats go in there and attack Russian ships about 3 hours before war was officially declared. In short,
In 3.1 kilometers, continue straight on 129, Tandong Sora Avenue north.
the Japanese will destroy the Russian Far Eastern Fleet. The Russian leaders around the Tsar, who are so caught off guard by this, they didn't think the Japanese would attack them or didn't have it in them. Attack a right power, send the fleet that they have in the Baltic Fleet from up near Finland, all the way to Japan to teach these Oriental people a lesson. Takes months to get there, and when they get there, the Japanese beat that too. In stunning fashion. It's not like a close fight at all. Boom. On land, it's more of a harder slog. for simple reasons. I mean, we're like a decade away from the First World War, and all of those lessons they're going to learn in the first year of the First World War, like, you can't charge machine guns frontally, the impact of, defense. I mean, all the stuff you're going to learn, the Japanese get to learn against the Russians on land, and there are horrible photos showing just, like walls of Japanese soldiers dead in front of these fortified positions because, often led by an officer with a samurai sword, they blindly and fanatically charged. Now, you don't have to think of yourselves as samurai to do that, because we all know the European powers will do that in less than 10 years. Nonetheless, what you see here is the Japanese finding out that the cost of this path on which they have embarked to emulate the colonial powers is not going to come as easy as that war in China. You're not going to lose 1,500 or less dead, down the road here. It's a commitment, and against the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese lose something more like 40,000 dead. The Russians too, by the way. It's nasty. It's World War I fighting before World War I, and it's all the early war stuff when everybody, has to learn the terrible lessons, about charging into artillery. I mean, it's nasty and horrible. And then there's disease too, as all these wars during this time period have a terrible problem with. It also, and this is another lesson of modern war, the other great powers will learn very soon, it takes a horrible toll, modern war does, on your economy, and the Russian economy and the Japanese economy will instantly start to feel the pinch and then the stretch, and it gets to the point where the Japanese secretly go to American President Teddy Roosevelt and ask if he can get both countries out of this mess and broker some kind of a deal, which he does, and wins the Nobel Peace Prize for, by the way. But a decent number of people in Japan think that the American president, in his peace deal, ripped the Japanese off. That they essentially won this war, but they didn't come out of it with a treaty that, looked anything like hitting the jackpot did in the first Sino-Japanese War. This looked more like a treaty, for countries that had a tie rather than one, at least where the Japanese people, reading a biased press that magnified their victories, think that they had dominated, lose all these lives, all this money, beat the Russians in all these battles, and not get significant territory or a big financial indemnity. When the terms of the agreement ending the Russo-Japanese War are made public, there will be violent riots in Japan, and people will die. The population there, in pretty much every history book you want to point out, people there take it as another grievance. The Japanese are holding on to grievances like the Wayne Man character did in the movie of the same name. They remember vividly, shall we call it, the triple intervention screw job that ended the Sino-Japanese War, where a bunch of Western powers who never would have settled for someone else doing that to them treated the Japanese in a way that the Japanese took personally. They saw it as changing the rules of the game when the Japanese start winning, and they often saw it in racial terms, and maybe not incorrectly. Well, now it was happening again. And not only was it happening again, but it was happening despite the fact that the Japanese had taken proactive measures to see that it didn't again. In 1902, they signed an alliance with Britain. Part of the reason they did it was they were hoping that if you have a great power on your side, a bunch of other great powers won't come in like they did last time and try to steal your kill. And yet here, with the agreement ending the Russo-Japanese War, it looks like it made no difference, and your kill got stolen again. Goes on the list of grievances. But it's very possible that the Japanese citizenry had unrealistic expectations. This is the way R. Taggart Murphy describes what Japan had wrought for itself in a decade, including 2 wars here, and it is far from insignificant.
In 300 meters, continue straight.
He writes, quote, Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War was, if anything, even more striking than its triumph 10 years earlier over the Qing Chinese. For the first time since the fall of Constantinople, a non-Christian, non-Western power defeated the forces of a Christian nation.
Continue straight on 129, Tandong Sora Avenue North.
Both the Japanese Navy and Army acquitted themselves brilliantly, with the Navy sinking much of the Russian fleet off the coast of Korea, while the Army...
In 900 meters, exit to C5 Tandang Sora Service Road North.
Battles on the Korean Peninsula, culminating in the siege of Port Arthur, led to Japanese mastery on land. Some of the consequences of the two wars were similar, he writes. Like the Qing, the Tsarist regime never recovered its prestige. Its defeat set the stage for the 1917 revolution. Meanwhile, just as Tokyo had picked up Taiwan as a spoil of the earlier war, so the 1905 settlement finally put Korea into its orbit. Tokyo had to use an ugly trick, he says, to force the abdication of Korea's King Gojong in order to legally convert Korea into an outright colony. But the trick, he says, was probably no worse than what the United States had done in 1893 to overthrow Queen Lalinoakani and incorporate Hawaii into the American Empire. Japan, he says, was behaving pretty much according to the standards of the time. More to the point, in fewer than 40 years, he writes,
In 300 meters, exit right, then stay to the right.
The country had transformed itself from a weak, tottering polity into the preeminent nation-state of Asia, and the first non-Western country in centuries that the great powers had to admit into their ranks. But the bill for that transformation had not yet been paid in full. It turned out to be far higher than anyone at the time could have imagined.
Exit right to C5 Tandang Sora Service Road North, then stay to the right to 170 Commonwealth Avenue North.
The reaction to Japan's victory.
Stay to the right, then turn right on 170 Commonwealth Avenue North.
The Russians, as historian Andrew Gordon says, runs the gamut from outrage to admiration.
Turn right on 170 Commonwealth Avenue North.
You got guys like the Emperor of Germany, the Kaiser, who's a believer in something he calls the Yellow Peril. All these innumerable Asian people like ants will join together someday and swamp Christendom. If you believe that, to a guy like that, it looks like the Japanese have emerged as the tip of the spear that will lead, the Asians to swamp.
In 2.9 kilometers, turn right on interim Batizang Pimbanza Road.
Christendom. But you have a lot of other European states that all of a sudden have become admirers. Some of them in turn, become fans of the Japanese after the victory over China, but after the victory over Russia, a bunch more people show up. And Japan, when the historians say that they kind of joined the great power club, it's more official than you think. They actually change, the level of the ambassadors that are sent to your country. All of a sudden, when people are debating things like in the United States, there'll be a debate over, is it good that the Japanese are taking over Korea or not? And there'll be people who write back, even experts and diplomats who are going, absolutely, what they're doing over there is the same thing we're doing in the Philippines. In other words, you really do get special consideration as a member of the, predator club as opposed to the prey club. Now, another viewpoint, though, you can look at is from the colonial victim viewpoint of people like the Koreans. This would be an awful period in history. They will suffer terribly. So from their viewpoint, this isn't a, good thing. This is a tragedy, and once again, keeps them from ruling themselves. They will be seen by the Japanese government the same way that colonial victims were often seen by the mother country. Sometimes, especially if the colonial victims are of a different skin color, they will be seen as less than human, or certainly less than Japanese. Second-class citizens from the get-go. But finally, there's another interesting group of people whose reaction here is important. The other non-white victims of colonialism, who have just seen something that inspires them. They've seen a non-white power punch the great powers in the nose in a way they could only dream of, and it gives them an opportunity to dream of the potential of maybe even the Japanese help doing that down the road. This idea maybe that the Japanese emergence in Asia is the beginning of the reality of a bunch of ideas that are sometimes called Pan-Asianism. The idea of it's basically the Kaiser's worst nightmare come true in a way that helps a bunch of people that would love to gain their freedom from non-Asian powers. Mr. Andrew Gordon Grant's quote. In places as distant as Turkey, Iran, and India, over the several years following the war, Japan's victory over Russia was invoked by modernizers and anti-imperialist activists as an inspiring harbinger of their own possibilities for nation building and independence from the West. End quote. The reason this is going to get weird, though, is this is a real thing, the idea of how this might be a useful, way for colonial victims to throw off the yoke of their oppressors with the help of powerful people in their region, maybe even with the same skin color. Let's look at it from a racial standpoint. An opportunity to be seized, maybe, right? And there are Japanese intellectuals and an entire, political history in Japan of people arguing that this should be what Japan does. Free the region, lead the region, become the economic powerhouse, the diplomatic superpower, all these things. It's a way Japan could have gone. It's a missed opportunity. It's a tragedy. If you're looking at it from people like Saburo Ayanaga's viewpoint, he wrote a book called The Pacific War. I may have said this in the late 1960s, and the point of the book is to try to figure out whether the Japanese public could have avoided, the terrible descent into war. Well, this is the time period where that opportunity best presents itself. And one of the ways, because the Japanese...
In 300 meters, turn right.
Just so you know, they're almost entirely...